In 1966, the CIA classified a book called The Adam and Eve Story. Written by electrical engineer and self-proclaimed cataclysmic geologist Chauncey P. Thomas, the book outlined the evidence and potential mechanisms for an apocalyptic catastrophe he believed would occur in the near future. A catastrophe involving, you guessed it, global earthquakes and flooding, triggered by a temporary decoupling of the Earth's crust from the mantle that results in the entire shell of the planet being reoriented such that the current poles move almost to the equator in less than half a day. Or, from the perspective of those on the surface, a sudden shift in the Earth's rotational axis. For those of you who haven't seen parts 1 and 2 of this series, they focus mainly on Sister Lucy's vision of the tip of the spear as a flame, a seemingly literal vision of the annihilation of nations mentioned in the second secret, involving global earthquakes and floods, apparently triggered by a disturbance of the Earth's axis. The Adam and Eve story was declassified in June of 2013, under the automatic declassification provisions of Executive Order 13526. You can find it here. It seems to have gone largely unnoticed until December 2018, when Ben Davidson of Suspicious Observers posted a video titled The Next End of the World, speculating about the CIA's motives and connecting the catastrophe to the ongoing migration of the magnetic poles. In the 2 years since, he's developed a theory of his own for how this event is triggered, a theory that not only fits perfectly with Lucy's description of the annihilation event and the aftermath I envisioned, but that offers the best explanation for what the miracle of the sun represented that I've ever heard. But before we get into that, let's set the mood a little. Here's Chan Thomas's description of the event, taken from Chapter 1 of the Adam and Eve story. Let's go with something obscure this time. With a rumble so low as to be inaudible, growing, throbbing, then fuming into a thundering roar, the earthquake starts. Only it's not like any earthquake in recorded history. In California, the mountains shake like ferns in a breeze. The mighty Pacific rears back and piles up into a mountain of water more than 2 miles high, then starts its race eastward. With the force of 1,000 armies, the wind attacks, ripping, shredding everything in its supersonic bombardment. The unbelievable mountain of Pacific seawater follows the wind eastward, burying Los Angeles and San Francisco as if they were but grains of sand. Nothing, but nothing, stops the relentless, overwhelming onslaught of wind and ocean. Across the continent, the 1,000-mile-per-hour wind wreaks its unholy vengeance. Everywhere, mercilessly, unceasingly. Every living thing is ripped into shreds while being blown across the countryside, and the earthquake leaves no place untouched. In many places, the Earth's molten sublayer breaks through and spreads a sea of white-hot liquid fire to add to the Holocaust. Within 3 hours, the fantastic wall of water moves across the continent, burying the wind-ravaged land under 2 miles of seething water coast to coast. In a fraction of a day, all vestiges of civilization are gone, and the great cities, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Dallas, New York, are nothing but legends. North America is not alone in her death throes. Central America suffers the same cannonade, wind, earth fire, and inundation. South America finds the Andes not high enough to stop the cataclysmic violence pounded out by nature in her berserk rage. In less than a day, Ecuador, Peru, and western Brazil are shaken madly by the devastating earthquake, burned by molten earth fire, buried under cubic miles of torrential Pacific seas, and then turned into a frozen hell. Everything freezes. Man, beast, plant, and mud are all rock hard in less than 4 hours. The Bay of Bengal Basin, just east of India, is now at the North Pole. The Pacific Ocean, just west of Peru, is at the South Pole. Greenland and Antarctica, now rotating equatorially in the torrid zone, find their ice caps dissolving madly in the tropical heat. Massive walls of water and ice surge toward the oceans, taking everything from mountains to plains in gushing, heaving paths, creating immense seasonal moraines. New ice caps begin to form in the new polar areas. Greenland and Antarctica emerge with verdant tropical foliage. Australia is the new unexplored continent in the North Temperate Zone, with only a few handfuls of survivors populating its vastness. New York lies at the bottom of the Atlantic, shattered, melted by earth fire, and covered by unbelievable amounts of mud. Of San Francisco and Los Angeles, not a trace is left. Once more, the Earth has shifted its 60-mile thick shell, with the poles moving almost to the equator in a fraction of a day. Again, the atmosphere and oceans, refusing to change directions with the Earth's shell, have wiped out almost all life. Man, we have a lot to talk about. Every time I do one of these, I think I'm finally done. I finally said all that there is to say about Fatima, but it just keeps coming up. So this time, just on a whim, I decided to check in with suspicious observers. You may recognize their logo from my first video. They're the ones who came up with the solar polar fields theory for how to cause earthquakes. And it had been 4 or 5 years since the last time I checked up on them, so I just wanted to see what they were up to. And boy, they've been busy! Not only did they find this CIA thing, but they also found stuff out of the Pentagon, the RAND Corporation, several scattered scientists across the last century, including Albert Einstein, believe it or not, all talking about this global earthquake and flooding scenario, and none of it came up in my searches the first time, back in 2017 when I made my first video. Nobody was talking about this until the CIA declassified this thing and Ben dug it up. And I was going to start by going through the history of that. All of the scientists who talked about it, how the CIA got involved, a detailed explanation of how the science works, but that turned into an hour-long deep dive, and about halfway through I realized that most of you probably aren't interested enough to sit through that. So I decided to make it a separate video. So if you want to hear all of the background, stay tuned for the next one, or use the links in the description to jump ahead to it now. For now, we're just going to talk about how this relates to the third secret. So, you may remember in my first video, I spent a long time trying to figure out how it was possible to cause global earthquakes at all, let alone ones powerful enough to open giant fissures that swallow cities, bury mountains, and break off parts of continents and have them sink into the ocean. A direct physics-defying act from God is always possible, but that's usually not how these things go, so I tried to come up with some kind of a natural mechanism that God would use to do that. I ended up settling on some kind of disturbance to the axis because that was specifically mentioned in the vision, but I couldn't come up with any way to do that other than something obviously wrong like crashing the moon into the Earth. But now thanks to this Declassified book, we finally have a mechanism that isn't pure science fiction. In fact, now we have a couple of ways of doing this, but they all boil down to the same trigger. I'll explain it in the next video, but to give you the super summarized version, you just bombard the Earth with an insane amount of electromagnetic energy. It's that simple. You do that and either the crust will unlock from the mantle at the low velocity zone and slide 90 degrees, or new mantle plumes burst out from the core along the current axis, destabilizing the rotation and tilting the whole planet over 90 degrees. That plays very well with my original theory about it being either a weapon or an accident involving a machine that gets out of control. Malachi Martin had said it involved some new form of energy production that was so immense that it could power the entire world and enable intergalactic travel. Several countries have proposed building power plants on the moon and beaming the energy back down in the form of microwaves or radio waves. It's not hard to picture a scenario where something like that, powered by this new form of energy, gets out of control and accidentally unleashes an enormous burst of energy that causes global earthquakes. And if you still like that theory, then you can stick with that. But I don't anymore. Because Suspicious Observers proposes another place where that burst of energy could come from. Something that doesn't require science fiction technology, and that actually fits the Fatima prophecy a lot better. It's the sun. Now, other people have suggested that before, but I've always rejected it for 2 reasons. First of all, solar flares don't even cause earthquakes, let alone global earthquakes. In fact, after the Carrington Event, the biggest solar flare we have on record, there were no major earthquakes anywhere on the planet for a whole year. So what's the difference here? About 3 orders of magnitude. What we're talking about here is not a CME, it's a micronova. Which sounds scary, but it's nowhere near as strong as a supernova. It wouldn't destroy the sun or any of the planets. It's just a really big burst of energy, and possibly planet-sized chunks of the solar shell. The other reason was that Russia has to be the instrument of the chastisement, right? So how could they cause the sun to do anything? And this is where I get to eat crow, because the evidence that Lucy said anything about Russia being the instrument of the chastisement is not quite as solid as I made it out to be. Let's go through our sources again. First was the interview with Father Fuentes. I had said that some people think this is fake, and I happen to be one of them. First of all, it wasn't really an interview. What we have is actually a transcription of a sermon that Father Fuentes gave where he recalled off the top of his head a conversation he had with Lucy 5 months earlier. So at a minimum, we have some potential data integrity issues. But more than that, there are things she says in that interview that she never says anywhere else. That the punishment from heaven is imminent, and her overall tone of urgency at the approach of 1960. That Our Lady mentioned the annihilation of nations to the 3 seers many times, which is wrong. The only time Our Lady mentioned it to all 3 of them at once was July 13th in the secret. Lucy was ordered to write down everything that pertained to the main apparitions, which was the only time the 3 of them saw Our Lady together, so if it had been mentioned again, we would have it. That the devil is in the mood for engaging in a decisive battle, and that these are the last times. That Our Lady had given new efficacy to the Rosary, that the Rosary and the devotion to the Immaculate Heart were the 2 last remedies that God will offer the world, and that Russia would be the instrument of the annihilation of nations. None of this is mentioned in any other source material. Some people think she was in fear of her life here, and so she was talking a little more openly than usual. But I don't see why she wouldn't have mentioned something like the new efficacy of the rosary before this. To me, it just doesn't fit. Next were these letters from Lucy. In them, she talks about Russia being the instrument of chastisement against Spain during World War II, as they had been during the Spanish Civil War. I was interpreting this as being a type or prefigure of the chastisement of the world, but that's not what it actually says. And in my defense, I did show them on screen, but I should have been more clear about that. I apologize. In good theory crafting, you present both the stuff that supports and contradicts your theory. I'll try to do better. And the last source was Father Malachi Martin. There's no getting around this one. He was very clear several times that he believed that Russia was the instrument of the chastisement. So the options here are either you believe he was lying, and yeah, that's possible, or all of the issues that I brought up with his testimony before. That he read The Secret once, 30 years before we started talking about it, that he frequently liked to mix in his own theories when he talked about it, and that sometimes he misremembered things that we could actually verify. So, if you include those three sources, you're stuck with the chastisement being triggered by something man-made. But if you dismiss them, it's possible for it to be caused by the sun. But that does raise a question. Actually, it raises several, such as why would God put us on a planet where the sun does this? But there are ways of making that fit with Catholic tradition. I'll let you sort that out however you want. The question I had in mind is, if the sun going nova is just something that happens naturally every so often, how would the consecration of Russia have prevented this? Given the mechanics involved, I don't think it would have prevented the nova itself. I think its effects just would have been less bad, either miraculously or by our being better prepared for it. Remember, the consecration was supposed to prevent World War II from happening. The last century would have been an era of peace. Instead of hiding all of this from the public and wasting time and energy fighting each other, maybe the governments of the world could have worked together, storing up food and building shelters that could weather the earthquakes, and encouraging individual preparedness, enabling maximum survival and minimizing the disruption to the continuity of civilization. Heck, World War II was such a turning point in history that without it, maybe our technological development would have taken a completely different course. Maybe Russia would have invented a way to block the solar outburst with a force field or something. Yes, I know that's the ending of Assassin's Creed 3. It probably just would have been miraculous, though. Remember the vision of the Bishop in White, where the angel shoots fire from his sword and Our Lady blocks it with her hand, preventing it from hitting the earth? That might be kind of literal. Now, why do I think a nova works much better than a man-made device? Other than that, it doesn't require science fiction technology to happen. There is one thing about Fatima that has always bothered me, ever since I was first told about it as a child. Something that never made sense. Something that nobody has ever been able to adequately explain, including myself. Why did the sun turn red and come crashing down to the horizon at the end of the Miracle of the Sun? It always seemed like this bizarre, out-of-place detail, but that obviously had something to do with the chastisement. Well, here's a neat little factoid about recurrent micronovas. The main way that they're caused is through accretion, accumulation of dust and gas in the solar atmosphere, until eventually it becomes so thick and is absorbing so much heat from the solar wind that it undergoes nuclear fusion and gets blown back into space in one big wave. Well, as the dust began to accumulate, both on the sun and in the space between it and the Earth, from our perspective, the sun would turn red. Yes, Phase 3 of the Miracle of the Sun was literal. The sun will actually turn red and come crashing down 90 degrees to the horizon when the crust slides. Because remember, it was exactly noon when the miracle happened. That's important because the sun was at its zenith. That allowed it to show off a full 90 degrees of movement when it moved down to the horizon. We'll go into more detail later. The other reason I favor the nova theory is because it appears to be in the process of happening now. The same thing that will eventually cause the sun to nova is currently causing the Earth's magnetic field to weaken. Nobody knows for sure why it's happening. It's fading at an accelerating rate. There's nothing we can do to stop it, and it has the potential to end civilization by itself. How, you might ask? Well, you may have heard of this little thing called the Carrington Event. In 1859, the Earth was hit with an X-30 solar flare, the biggest to directly hit us in the modern record. Skies across the planet, as far down as the equator, erupted in red, green, and purple auroras, so bright that you could read a newspaper as easily in the middle of the night as you could in daylight. The birds began to chirp, and people got up to go to work because they thought it was dawn. This went on for almost an entire week, as a second flare hit a few days later. One account from South Carolina describes that the red light was so vivid that the roofs of the houses and the leaves of the trees appeared as if covered with blood. The sky was so crimson that many who saw it believed the neighboring locales were on fire. Sound familiar? Remember the night illumined by an unknown light? The sign predicted at Fatima that heralded the start of World War II? We'll come back to that. The real problem, though, is that solar storms of this kind induce an electrical current in everything. There was very little in the way of electricity back in 1859. All they really had were telegraphs. Well, there was so much current induced in the telegraph wires that the platinum contacts on the telegraph machines were in danger of melting, and there were streams of fire pouring forth from the circuits. Showers of sparks set fire to telegraph paper, and eventually they noticed that if they disconnected the batteries, they were still able to send messages using just the induced current in the lines. There are some people who say that it caused telegraph wires to burst into flames and start forest fires, but I can't find any actual sources for that. I think these are just exaggerations that have been repeated over the years. Or maybe they're confusing it with this other flare from 1921 that burned down a telegraph exchange in Sweden and a railroad control tower in New York. This was not the biggest flare to ever hit the Earth. The geological record shows much bigger events in the past. For example, the Charlemagne event in 775 AD. Estimates vary, but they think that on average we get hit with a Carrington-level flare every 150 to 500 years. What would happen if we got hit with one today? Would power lines melt? Would the wiring in the walls of your house ignite? Would it fry all of our satellites? Blow up large batteries? Corrupt magnetic hard drives? This question has been looked at by groups like the National Academy of Sciences, FEMA, the Department of Homeland Security, and several others throughout the world, and the answer is, we have no idea. There are measures in place to try to manage the currents from solar storms, because even the smaller ones have caused problems. For example, a storm in 1989 caused rolling blackouts across Quebec and blew up a large step-up transformer in a nuclear plant in New Jersey. The doomsday scenario is if it destroys the extremely high-voltage transformers. They're critical linchpins to the national grid. We have very few spares, and it takes about a year to make a new one, and that's when we have functioning infrastructure. If all of them went down at the same time, it could take a decade before we got reliable power back, at least nationwide. You could set up some smaller local grids in the interim. The good news is we would get warning that one is coming. Their speed varies a little, but the Carrington event took about 17.5 hours to get here. We would know about it within 8 minutes because that's how long it takes light to reach Earth, and we have people constantly monitoring this. Theoretically, if we knew the big one was coming, we could shut down the grid and ground critical infrastructure. And there have been some other proposals, like Homeland Security's Emergency Spare Transformer program, where they would have special recovery transformers loaded on flatbed trucks at all times that could be rolled out quickly. In 2012, they did a field test and were able to get one up and running in 6 days. Though as far as I can tell, they never actually went forward with the program. So, best case scenario, we could have power back in most places within a week. Worst case, society collapses. That's if it was the same strength as the Carrington event, though. Ultimately, there is a level of induced current that would simply melt everything, in the same way that shorting a car battery with a thin wire will melt the wire. And this is why the magnetic field weakening is so worrying. The weaker the field gets, the stronger the effect of any given flare. For example, our field is about 20% weaker than it was when the Carrington event hit. At that level, it may only take an X20 flare to cause the same amount of damage, rather than an X30. If the field strength gets low enough, we could have a Carrington event every other year. In fact, if that tiny CME that hit us on May 12th but registered as a KP7 is any indication, even just the ordinary solar wind might prevent long-range transmission of electricity. At the current rate of the field weakening, Ben thinks we have about a 20 to 25% chance of the big one hitting in the next 10 years. He expects full field reversal somewhere between 2040 and 2060, and the nova anywhere between 2030 and 2060. That happens to line up pretty well with the Fatima timeline. And yes, I'm abandoning 2017 as the start date. I mean, I guess it could still happen in the next 2 years, but the only reason I went with that date was because I didn't think we could possibly make it to 2029 without everything falling apart. And maybe I was right. But if it isn't caused by a weapon, then it's not necessarily tied to the war mentioned at the end of the Vision of the Tip of the Spear, so the timing of World War III wouldn't necessarily have any bearing on the timing of the Annihilation event. Speaking of the timeline, let's talk about what this changes. Or rather, what it adds, because very little of what we talked about before actually changes. It's just much worse than I thought it was. We'll quickly go through Fatima's 3 main visions again. The Miracle of the Sun, which gives us a timeline of celestial events leading up to the chastisement. The Tip of the Spear, which shows us the events during the chastisement, the destruction. And the Bishop in White, which shows us the political ramifications, the aftermath. So, before, during, and after. My 200-page Fatima report is up to 300 pages now. Among the new material is some witness testimony about the Miracle of the Sun I didn't have before. I'll put some of the relevant bits on screen if you want to pause and read them, but I just wanted to use this as an opportunity to go into a little more detail about it, because I actually got some of the details wrong last time. Not because I didn't have the new material, but just because somehow I never spent enough time thinking about this. I've previously described the miracle as having 3 phases, but strictly speaking what we have are 3 behaviors. The colors, the smaller movements, and the big movement when it crashes down to the horizon. Not everybody mentions all 3. Some people mention 2 or just 1. But almost everyone puts them in that order. There was one newspaper article that put the movement before the colors, but that might have been bad reporting. And one guy who put the colors toward the end, but he explicitly says his memory was fuzzy. There are two people who draw a distinct line between phases 1 and 2, that the colors stopped and then the motion started. Everybody else is vague about that. There were also two people who said that the motion stopped and then started again. One says it happened twice, the other 3 times. And then after that is when it fell. So that kind of draws a line between phase 2 and 3. And that's why I break it up like that. Taken all together, that's the impression that I get. But strictly speaking, the colors could have been going on during the motion, and the motion could be seen as gradually building into the more dramatic motion in phase 3. Why do I bring all this up? Because I'm not sure this all represents one event anymore. These could be 3 milestones in a much longer process spaced out over the course of years. Because under this new theory, phase 3 clearly has to be the nova. But the sun turning red isn't something that's going to happen in a day. That's a gradual process that will unfold over the course of months or even years. What are phases 1 and 2 then? The nova is what triggers everything. There wouldn't be anything immediately before that. But there would be a number of events in the years leading up to that these could represent. So, here's my new timeline. I think that phase 1 represents a Carrington-level solar storm, occurring either on June 13th, 2029 or within 6 years of that. Again, I draw the line at 2035 because the rise of Napoleon was 6 years after the centenary of the request to the King of France, and plenty of things happened in that time span. I would honestly expect it by the end of 2030. That's after solar maximum, but still well within the range of when something like that could happen. I've always thought that the colors represented some kind of auroral phenomenon. There's really nothing else that can make colors appear in the sky like that. All of the colors mentioned do appear in normal auroras. The red and green comes from oxygen plasma, and the blue and purple comes from nitrogen plasma. The orange and yellows are just a mixture of the red and green. The presence of the full spectrum of possible colors, and the intense brightness of the colored light, vividly coloring everything on the ground in broad daylight, indicates that the induced current is very high, so this would be Carrington level or stronger. At a minimum, this would almost certainly take out most of our satellites, and there are a lot more things that rely on GPS than you think, like cell phone towers and ATMs, and farm equipment, and the stock market. It's also worth noting that if the power is out for longer than a week, there's a good chance that several nuclear plants will melt down because their coolant systems have no power. I believe they're required to have about a week's worth of fuel for their backup generators. Some of them might be able to shut the plant down safely in that time, but in all of the chaos this would cause, I'm sure at least some of them won't. Will it permanently take down the electrical grid? That depends on whether you want to look at this as a warning or the beginning of the chastisement. If it's a warning that the chastisement is coming, then you'd think we'd get out of that without too much damage. Assuming the high voltage transformer survived, that would still be a week minimum without power. Realistically, probably more like 2 or 3 weeks. In that case, it would signal the beginning of a new era of turmoil. Maybe the grid would never fully recover, or it would start to become really unreliable after that. But if we're marking milestones, a full grid collapse would be a pretty big one, so that's at least as possible. Just as the beginning of World War II was heralded by the night illumined by an unknown light, a phenomenon strongly resembling a red aurora, so the beginning of the chastisement will be heralded by this auroral event. But whether or not the grid survives, the internet will not. The fiber optic repeaters on the transoceanic internet backbone would definitely be destroyed, and I don't know that anyone would fix them. We've already been moving toward each country having its own internet, one governed by its own laws with extremely limited access to the internet of other countries, typical compartmentalization. So even if it is feasible to repair it in a reasonable amount of time, they may just decide that it's preferable not to. Now, some people describe the colors being in rays or shafts of light. Others describe it as a glow or an aureole surrounding the sun. Why would it be portrayed like this instead of as an actual aurora, if that's what it's supposed to represent? Well, as it turns out, there's a type of aurora that looks exactly like this, called a corona aurora, because it resembles a crown. It does seem unlikely that it would center perfectly around the sun like that, though, so that might have been either just to draw attention to the sun or to show that the sun was causing all of this. I do have one other idea, but we'll come back to that. Next, it started moving around, and this motion is variously described as shaking, dancing, trembling, rotating, and spinning. All of these are very small motions. One person says it wandered within the circle of the receded clouds. That's a more dramatic motion, and probably what they meant by dancing. That I can explain. In the years leading up to the nova, the thermoelectric plasticity of the low velocity zone would start to fail. The crust would be able to move more freely, and we would start to see larger rotation glitches, either moving the crust or changing the axis by maybe as much as 5 degrees. Or, like I said last time, it could just represent really big earthquakes, that from the perspective of the people on the ground, the sun and everything in the sky were shaking violently. This movement started and stopped 2 or 3 times, so there would probably be several incidents like this in the years between phase 1 and 3. It's the rotating motion around the edge that I'm not sure what to do with. If we blend phases 1 and 2 and assume that this is still an auroral light, then it could be a spiral aurora or space hurricane. These are rare and short-lived. The reason that auroras are normally shaped like ribbons and curtains is because the plasma sticks to the magnetic field lines. So in order to get it into a spiral, as I understand it, you have to really sharply punch a hole in the magnetic field, so that the reconnecting field lines temporarily form a spiral. It would be unlikely for the sun to appear directly at its center, though. If it's not the light from phase 1, then I'm not sure what to make of it. Several people compare it to a common type of fireworks on a wheel. I assume they're talking about a Catherine wheel. Here's some footage of a few examples, just to give you an idea of what they might be talking about. One person says that it had sparks of light coming out of the edge. I should note, however, that that comes from a translation that I know is bad, and I don't have the original Portuguese, so I can't check to see if that's actually what it says. But if it's correct, then that would be consistent with that type of firework. Last time I said that the spinning motion almost certainly has to be caused by a magnetic field. I compared it to a plasma vortex. But if this isn't some kind of solar storm, then I can't think of what else it would be. We don't know much about what a star that's undergoing accretion would look like close up on its way to going nova. Maybe it would do something that would appear that way? Perhaps some kind of plasma formation? Ben does talk about something similar in his videos, though I don't know if it would be spinning. But if we're not going with something that literally looks like that, then this could be meant to represent an increase in the sun's rotational speed, which is something Ben is expecting to see in the years leading up to the nova. The Earth's rotational speed is already increasing, just very, very slightly. And lastly, phase 3. Nobody actually says it turns red before it crashes down, but the change is implied. Several people say that at this phase, it looked fiery. It's compared to a fire wheel, a fireball, and a fiery millstone. All of those call to mind an orange-red color. This is a sharp difference from phase 1, where it was described as being various shades of off-white. There it was compared to a luminous silver disk, a brightly polished wheel of iridescent mother-of-pearl, the moon, and a ball of snow. So at some point in this process it went from being a bright off-white to a fiery orange-red. And basically everyone I've encountered presumes that transition took place at the beginning of phase 3, right before it fell. Now, I skipped over this before, but why did it look like a radiant silvery white in phase 1? Obviously it had to be dimmed so that people could look at it without hurting their eyes, but why that particular appearance? Guess what color the sun is expected to turn before it turns red? The filtering of various color spectra is diminished under the ongoing weakening of Earth's field, such that the yellow sun now appears so brightly white at the top of the sky that it has brilliant rays radially shooting out like it's wearing a crown. I am not making this up. That's a page from his book. And he doesn't know what Fatima is. At least as far as I know, certainly not to this kind of detail. What he's actually doing here is comparing it to the Four Horsemen. If the accretion process continues, it would eventually go from fiery orange-red to black. And he makes some potential connections there with the 3 days darkness. Then after the nova, it would look pale, so the fourth horse. I don't really buy that as a valid interpretation of Apocalypse 6, but it is neat. And, well, assuming that Lucy actually did say the secret pertains to Apocalypse 8 through 13, that would mean that right before the event happens, we would be in Apocalypse 6, the Four Horsemen. So, make of that what you will. Based on phase 3 of the miracle, though, it doesn't look like it will actually get to the point of turning black. So presumably a plasma instability or the increasing rotation speed sets it off before accretion gets that far. Now, he says this has already happened, that the sun used to be yellow and is now white. And he is not alone. I've never run into this before, but there are a lot of people who are saying that the sun used to look more yellow and that it's turned white. It looks like this started gaining popularity in 2017, but I've found people as far back as 2003 talking about it. Personally, I do feel like I remember it being more yellow back in the 80s and 90s, but that could easily be my memory. On the other hand, our sun is classified as a yellow dwarf, and I feel like there's no way it would have been named that if it looked like this when they named it. So maybe we're already seeing the beginning of phase 1, or maybe it'll get even whiter going into 2029, and start to have more obvious rays. And that's the other possible reason why the colors were depicted in rays rather than typical ribbon auroras. By the way, Ben has never explained why he expects the sun to turn red, but I assume he's talking about interstellar reddening. Basically, when you're looking through cosmic dust and gas, it tends to absorb shorter wavelengths and make things look more red. The same principle makes the sun look orange and red at sunset and sunrise. There's more atmosphere between you and the sun when it's on the horizon than when it's at a higher angle, so it distorts the light more. and the main trigger of the nova is that cosmic dust and gas gets carried into our solar system by the galactic current sheet and accumulates in the solar corona. It turning black is just sort of a logical extension of that. Once the dust has accumulated enough, it eventually just blocks the light completely. Although he may also have been inspired by other ancient stories of the sun turning dark before a great disaster. So it makes sense, but I just wanted to clarify it's not something we've seen happen with other novas, at least as far as I know. I also want to call attention to this one little line. There was a little boy who said that after the miracle was over, the sun resumed its place as pale and without splendor. In other words, it remained dimmer and pale afterwards, like Ben is saying that it would after the nova. He's the only one who mentioned that, and that might be a translation issue, but I just thought I'd point it out. There's one other interpretation of this I can think of. The surface of the moon is glazed. It's thought that might be from a previous nova, so if another one were to happen, it would glow red hot. So maybe we're actually looking at the moon, not the sun, but overall I don't think it works as well. It's just a possible interpretation I thought I'd include. Then we have the crashing. Like I said before, this represents the crust detaching and then sliding 90 degrees. Everybody describes this as it looked like the sun was going to fall to Earth. But there are two ways you can interpret that. Either it looked like the sun was getting bigger and bigger, which is what it would actually look like, or it was moving vertically, or both. Two people describe it as moving in a zigzag pattern, so that means there was definitely vertical motion. It was exactly noon when the miracle happened, so the sun was more or less at its zenith. But this was October in Portugal, so it wouldn't have been 90 degrees straight up. It would have been significantly off to the south. What direction did it move in? We don't know. How far did it travel? We don't know. There is one person who said it descended almost to the point of setting the Earth on fire with its rays, so that sounds reasonably close to the horizon. It would be possible for it to have shown off a full 90 degrees of motion if it went from south to north, but all taken, it probably didn't actually move that far. I don't know if that's supposed to mean that the crust will not move a full 90 degrees, or if, like the rest of the miracle, this is just a representative display, and not to be taken as a mathematically accurate demonstration. The detail about it moving in a zigzag is interesting, though. I assume they're talking about an S-shaped zigzag rather than an angular one. I've tried many times to picture what it would look like on the ground as the crust was displaced and the poles moved to the equator, but it's tricky because, while it's sliding in that direction, the crust is still rotating on its original axis, and at the same time, there would probably be at least some friction between the mantle and the crust, so the mantle would be dragging it slightly west to east as it's sliding north to south. And what kind of course the sun would take in the sky would depend on how fast that goes and where you're standing, but an S-shape seems like something that would be possible. The last detail I want to bring up is the heat. A few people mentioned it. One described it as being in an overheated steam room, and after the miracle was over, the ground and their clothes were all dry. Well, as you might imagine, a nova will definitely make things hotter. Here's another quote from Ben's last book. The initial eruption will produce a bright flash of visible UV and X-ray light, which may thermally and energetically destroy parts of the biosphere. In other words, if you're in the central area of the sun-facing side of the planet when this thing pops, and you're not in an underground shelter, you're probably gonna fry. Timeline for the nova? I don't know. Ben thinks 2040 to 2060. Fatima only gives us one date, and even that's interpretive. So if we're using that date for the beginning of the process, then we have no indication of when it ends. I guess you could try to draw something from the fact that the miracle went on for 8 to 10 minutes, by most estimations, so maybe you could try to extrapolate that into 8 to 10 years, but that's just grasping at straws. I do also want to note, it is still possible that this is all one event. Theoretically, there are other ways to trigger a nova besides accretion. So you could argue that the colors in Phase 1 are the geomagnetic storm caused by the nova itself, Phase 2 is the beginnings of the earthquakes and some kind of plasma formation around the sun, and then in Phase 3 the sun turns red because of the dust from the nova itself distorting the light, and it's at that point that the crustal displacement gets fully underway. On the science, that's much less likely, and the 2029 through 2036 window that I interpret for the Fatima event is a bit early for the nova given the rate that the Earth's magnetic field is weakening, but I wanted to mention it as a possibility just to be thorough. Okay, time to revisit my old favorite, the vision of the tip of the sphere as a flame. This all makes so much more sense now, and it's so much worse than I thought it was, because I would never have entertained something as wild as crustal displacement without having been shown the science. So, what is the tip of the sphere as a flame? If we're going with this being the nova, then there's really no way to interpret this literally. It would certainly be fiery, but there's really no way you could compare an omnidirectional explosion to a spear. There would be some ejecta, pieces of the solar shell that get shotgunned out. Some of those would probably hit Earth. And you could probably get away with saying that fulfills Akita's prediction that a fire will fall from the sky and wipe out a great part of humanity. But that's not what touches the axis and causes the earthquakes, so that really doesn't work. I am disappointingly left to conclude that this is just another way of representing the angel's flaming sword from the Vision of the Bishop in White. Maybe it's supposed to be a description of the flame that comes off of the sword, like a spear of fire shoots out of the sword. In other words, it's symbolic. Unless there is actually another way to interpret the third phase of the Miracle of the Sun. I don't think it works as well overall, but there are some pieces that fit better if you want to try to plug this into Apocalypse. Again, Apocalypse isn't necessarily in chronological order. In particular, the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 vials might just be 3 different ways of describing the same set of events. Each of them ends with a great earthquake, and 2 of them have the sun going dark either right before or at the same time. But if you do want to put them in chronological order, the earthquake in Apocalypse 16 is described as a great earthquake, such a one as has never been since men were upon the earth, and that every island fled away and the mountains were not found. If you're trying to plug these events together, then that would have to be the Nova. Nothing is going to be bigger than that anywhere in the foreseeable future. Now, Frere Michel reported that somebody claimed Lucy told them the secret pertains to the apocalypse, and specifically mentioned chapters 8 through 13. Again, that's questionable, and even if she did, it was probably something she came up with because the angel casting fire in the 7th seal reminded her of the angel with the flaming sword she'd seen in her visions. But if we want to stick with that, there is another way to explain the earthquake in chapter 8 that still conforms to the Fatima visions. What if the sun turns red, but before it goes nova, its activity level increases and we get hit with a mega flare? In this case, we would interpret the falling of the sun as representing the flare heading at Earth, and the zigzag motion was simply a way of showing its descent, as it was depicted in the movie The 13th Day. And while it wouldn't literally look like one, a coronal mass ejection could certainly be characterized as a flaming spear hurtled at Earth. And if you've ever seen footage of the way that one comes off of the sun, unlatch isn't a bad word for it. The touching of the axis is still symbolic, simply a way of representing that it's the spear that disturbs the axis, and it's the movement of the axis that causes the subsequent destruction. And the axis would literally shake and shudder. However, this does not trigger the crustal displacement. This is just a very significant rotation glitch that causes global earthquakes and tsunamis. Afterwards, the sun continues to darken until eventually we get to Apocalypse 16, where it goes fully black, and then we have the nova, which triggers the ultraquake, which is the crustal displacement. Obviously, in this scenario, since we're taking a chronological interpretation of Apocalypse, that would mean the Antichrist shows up before this. Whereas in my primary interpretation, which isn't strictly chronological, it could go either way. And then after that would be the 1,000-year reign of Christ from Apocalypse 20, which would correspond to the period of peace that Our Lady promised would be granted to the world after the consecration. But this still doesn't fit perfectly. You'd have to explain the sun going black and the moon going red in Apocalypse 6 as just being an eclipse, because it's not going to go black, then go back to normal, then go black again. Unless there's enough dust in the galactic current sheet to cause the sun to nova twice, but that's kind of pushing it. The 7 trumpets are also better explained by the nova because that includes the impactors, the pieces of the solar shell. And then there's the torrential rain. A flare would definitely cause some evaporation, but probably not enough to create rainstorms that wash away houses. But overall, this idea is close enough that you could stretch and make it work, so I thought I would offer it as an alternative version. But getting back to the good stuff. I struggled for a long time with the phrasing that mountains and cities are buried. I could not imagine a way for that to be literal. And last time, remember I was saying that earthquakes rarely open up fissures, and even when they do, they're never really that deep? But with crustal displacement, that makes perfect sense. You could have giant fissures going straight down to the mantle. Of course some cities and mountains can fall into them. And the lithospheric heaving would cause some areas to rise and others to sink, potentially being buried under the ground or submerged in the ocean. A literal annihilation of nations, as in the landmass ceases to exist. Father Martin saying whole sections of the continents will be washed away forever doesn't sound so crazy anymore. Actually, you know how in Apocalypse the beast and the false prophet get cast into a sea of fire? I wonder if there could be a literal component to that. There's no way to tell what areas are going to rise or sink, but I recall again St. Patrick's prophecy about Ireland sinking into the ocean before the coming of the Antichrist, so that's at least one place I wouldn't want to be. The flooding of the sea and the rivers. The water is not attached to the ground. If the Earth were to suddenly stop rotating or suddenly change direction, the oceans would not. They just keep going. Now, the Earth isn't going to just stop rotating on a dime, so I think Chan Thomas's story about supersonic waves is unreasonable. There may be a change in rotational velocity before the crust unlocks. Then once it does unlock, the land is going to be moving into the water as the water is carried by its momentum over the moving land. It's expected that the weight of the ice in Greenland and a corresponding imbalance in ice mass in Antarctica is going to move the crust in roughly this direction. So, in North America, initially, the momentum of the water and the continued rotation of the crust are in the same direction. So other than perhaps a small change in rotational speed, all of the water's motion would be south to north, or on the other side of the world, north to south. And this is the motion that Ben shows in his diagrams. But this immediately gets much more complicated because the crust is still rotating on its original axis. Friction will eventually slow it down, but it's going to keep going for a while. And as that tilting axis becomes more and more perpendicular to the momentum of the water, we'll see more west to east movement. So once the pole has slid down to this position, the water's momentum is still going west to east relative to the core, carrying it this way, the weight of the ice is moving the land this way, and the rotational momentum is moving it this way. And it's at this point my brain says, stop trying to draw vector diagrams, you don't know what you're doing. If you want to see Ben's attempt at figuring out what parts of the world are going to get flooded, I'll link that video below. He thinks it's going to be more of a fast-moving high tide rather than giant waves. Though the earthquakes, fissures, and lithospheric heaving could certainly add waves on top of that. And remember, after the water has finished moving one way, it will slosh back the other way, just like a tsunami. So even if you don't get any of the brunt of it, you'll still get the tail end of it. And after hearing all of that, I bet some of you have already called to mind that interview with John Paul II from the October 1981 issue of Stimme des Glaubens. If there is a message in which it is written that the oceans will flood whole areas of the earth, and that from one moment to the next millions of people will perish. The wording on that is much more precise this way. It's the oceans that will intrude upon the land, and it will literally be one moment to the next millions of people dying. For that matter, it's a much better fit for Lucy's description, that the sea will emerge from its limits, overflowing and bringing with it houses and people in numbers that are not possible to count. In addition, there's about twice as much water locked in the crust and mantle as there is in the ocean, and a lot of that could just start coming up out of the ground, which is probably what Genesis means by the fountains of the great deep, and is where most of the water for Noah's flood came from. It might also be why Lucy mentions three sources for the flooding: the sea, the rivers, and the clouds. The sea obviously means the oceans, and we know from the letter that the clouds refers to torrential rain. The mention of rivers could be redundant, because obviously the oceans and the rain are going to cause the rivers to surge, but she could mean that they'll flood independently because of all of this water coming out of the ground. Suffice to say, this is how you flood entire parts of continents. This is how you end up with seashells on top of mountains. Bear in mind that in the aftermath, the tidal patterns in the oceans and the seas around the world would all be different, because the orientation of the land and the relative position of the moon have changed. Which calls to mind Luke chapter 22, and there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations, by reason of the confusion of the roaring of the sea and of the waves, men withering away for fear and expectation of what shall come upon the whole world, for the powers of the heavens shall be moved. Literally, everything in the heavens will change places. It also kind of calls to mind the promise of a new heaven and a new earth from Apocalypse 21. While we're on the subject, I might as well mention where the new poles are expected to be. This is just a best guess based on geological evidence and where the magnetic poles appear to be moving toward, but the new South Pole ends up somewhere around here, and the new North Pole ends up around here. The edge of that circle would be about as cold as northern Alaska. Yes, that's the most densely populated area of the planet. Yes, all of those people would freeze to death. Jerusalem would be about as cold as South Alaska, or Whitehorse, Canada. Japan would be Dawson. The northern US wouldn't change all that much. That would be about as cold as northern Ontario. Florida, however, would get significantly colder. Next, the wind. It was unclear from the vision itself whether or not strong windstorms were a major component of this. I'm going to use a clip from one of Ben's videos to explain this one, because I could not possibly describe it any better.
The Chan Thomas version of the catastrophe we heard in episode 1, where the Earth basically stops in its tracks and 1,000-mile-per-hour winds race across the planet, is unreasonable, and impossible everywhere outside the equatorial zone, since the higher latitudes are not rotating nearly as quickly. Not only would a gradual change over just hours leave considerable braking potential to that worst-case scenario, that goes double for those higher latitudes. Not to mention that in some areas the wind at surface level is not even going in the direction of rotation, especially around pressure cells, and the movements of those cells complicate the matter of wind even more. When you bring in the upper winds, you could get major instabilities, and even a gradual slowdown there would mean windstorms of a few hundred miles an hour whipping across various zones at once. Something like the polar vortex way above the surface and flying fast around the polar region would actually have the chance to be the most devastating wind element, since its speed would sustain and couple downwards in various unpredictable ways as the Earth's rotation changed. The point here is that the wind would be very bad, but not the 1,000-mile-per-hour bad, and not homogeneous across the globe. Tilts of the crust, by the way, complicate that location forecasting of the wind even more, and that is even before you consider the Hadley cells, Ferrel cells, and polar cells and how they would be affected. The picture presented is one of nearly absolute uncertainty, other than the fact that any change to rotation or tilt would likely leave very few places in the world without seeing at least one windstorm of about 200 miles per hour, maybe more, with others seeing it much, much worse.
I would only add that the heavy wind would contribute to the formation of large waves. Then there's the flood rains. This works much better than my old theory. Before, I couldn't really think of something that would cause earthquakes and torrential rain at the same time. In this scenario, not only would there be a huge amount of water evaporated from the heat produced by the initial flash, the solar particles, and the baffling amount of current induced in the atmosphere, on the surface, and under the surface, but the crustal displacement moves both ice caps to the equator. There's going to be a lot of water vapor. At the same time, the relativistic particles in the nova dust will serve as cloud condensation nuclei, allowing all of that vapor to quickly form giant storm clouds. Lightning. Now here's something new. As the Earth's magnetic field weakens, more energetic particles can get through. I'm not sure how well accepted the science of this analogy would be, but think of the Earth like a capacitor. As energy comes in from space, it charges up. It can only hold so much, eventually it needs to discharge. Normally it maintains a relative equilibrium through a series of processes called the global electric circuit. I won't get into that. But lightning is one of those processes, and we're already seeing increases in lightning, particularly in the Arctic. We're also seeing anecdotally an uptick in Earth discharges. That's lightning that starts at the ground and then fingers upward. So lightning is going to start to become an issue even leading up to this. During the event, between the massive storm clouds and the baffling amount of induced current, the lightning would be biblical. And that's just the regular lightning. Ben theorizes that if the L-shell magnetic fields are compressed and energized enough, it could result in giant bolts of planetary-scale lightning. Check out his video in the description if you want the details. While we're at it, let's update some of the short-term aftermath that isn't mentioned explicitly in the vision. The ones I talked about before are unchanged: volcanoes, nuclear plants, chemical spills. But the scenario does introduce a few new ones. As the magnetic field continues to weaken, more solar protons will be able to get in. These destroy ozone, which increases the amount of UVB and UVC radiation that reaches the ground. It may not get that bad, but it could get to the point of causing minor skin burns or photokeratitis, basically snow blindness, as well as stunting plant growth or even damaging the DNA of pollen and spores, making it even more difficult to grow food in the aftermath. At the same time, the dust and gas from the nova will linger in the inner solar system and our upper atmosphere, blocking a substantial amount of light. This could tie to the fourth trumpet from Apocalypse 8, where a third of the sun, moon, and stars are darkened, and a third of the day and the night did not shine. Or Matthew 24, where it says, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days the sun shall be darkened and the moon shall not give her light." I also still think it's possible that the Earth's rotation will speed up to the point where a day is a third shorter, or only 16 hours, but that's the less likely interpretation of that. This cosmic debris, combined with volcanic ash and increased albedo from the ice caps being at the equator, along with the heavier cloud cover from the polar ice and the ionization of the atmosphere from the increased cosmic rays, has the potential to cause a mini ice age. There's a reasonable amount of science behind this, and earlier cold periods in the planet's history also seem to line up with previous magnetic excursions. How cold would it be and how long would it last? Depends on a lot of things. This is the one element that's not mentioned in any of the visions or the Bible. It would contribute to the famine, but that's about as close a connection as you could make. This could potentially be averted, though, because after the nova the sun is expected to be super flaring. If we got hit with one or more of those quickly enough, it would warm the planet and interrupt the process. What does all of this do to my casualty estimates? I still think 30% fatality is a good lowball in urban and coastal areas. It's just, with the increased scope of the flooding, extend that number to everyone. There would be an insane amount of debris in the water, so the risk of being crushed or drowned is not limited to the urban areas. So that's what I'm going to stick with. Probably about a third of the world would die in the initial event. As far as in the long term, that will depend on how well prepared we are. And I'll use that as my segue into the last line of this vision: the war. I'm going to backpedal on what I said last time. Even with the way it's worded in the letter, you don't necessarily have to interpret this as the war starting before the event. I had said that the wording would be superfluous otherwise, but in the face of something as utterly world-ending as this, it actually is kind of worth commenting that people still keep on fighting even after this. But again, the war is emphasized as being especially destructive, and after the event, there really wouldn't be much left to destroy. So that's a point in favor of it starting before. But either way, it definitively resumes at some point afterward. And you might understandably look at me and ask, How? In a world where you can no longer have transmission of electricity over long ranges using wires, and where the massive increase of cosmic rays and solar storms would likely make it impossible for microprocessors to be used at all, how are we going to get back on our feet and have a major war? And this is where I disagree with Ben the most. He thinks this is going to be a reset, that none of the governments are going to come out of this intact, that nobody will be prepared enough to have significant resources or the numbers to have political or military power. I think this is wishful thinking, perhaps even a kind of faith that the dystopian nightmare we're heading for simply won't be allowed to happen. If you go with the tip of the spear being a megaflare, then you can make that work in terms of the prophecy, because the nova would be the very last plague in Apocalypse. But I don't believe this because of the prophecy. From a purely logical perspective, I don't see how the powers that be could fail to get through this, if they know it's coming, and I think they almost certainly do. We have testimony that the Pentagon was talking about crustal displacement as early as the 40s, and that they connected it to the acceleration of the movement of the Earth's magnetic poles. We don't know how seriously they ended up taking that, but think of the trillions and trillions of dollars of missing defense funds. Think of the deep underground and undersea military bases, ostensibly set up for continuity of government in the Cold War, but that would serve this purpose just as well. Think of projects like the Doomsday Arctic Seed Vault, or secret military bases in Antarctica, an enormous land that would become a tropical paradise rich in untapped resources if it were to move to the equator. Again, they see the Earth's field weakening. They know that another Carrington-level storm will happen someday. By some estimations, we're overdue for one. Given that the loss of electricity would very likely result in the collapse of social order, and that would very likely result in all of the people with the money and the power losing their influence, don't you think they would have some kind of plan in place to deal with that, rather than just hoping it doesn't happen anytime soon? But before we talk about what that plan is, let me first make my case for why I think it's entirely possible for modern civilization to survive this. And let me begin by addressing the most extreme scenario. Ben has floated the idea that the current induced by the nova might be so severe that everything metal on Earth melts, even down to loose change in your pocket. That seems utterly fantastical, and we'll come back to that later. But for the sake of argument, let's just go with it for now. There are a couple of ways to deal with it. One would be a giant Faraday shield. And when I say giant, I mean hollow out a mountain and line it with mile-thick copper plates. We're talking about a group with effectively infinite resources, and at some point the material will be thick enough to handle the current. The inside of it might turn into an oven while said current is flowing through it, but you could probably devise a way of cooling that. Alternatively, store all of your metal components in a mold so that when they melt, they reharden back into the same shape. This would probably not work for certain types of alloys, and you may have trouble with very small, precise components, but you could preserve enough to get you started. Because the last resort, of course, is to have stone forges set up and just reforge everything. It'd take a while, but as long as you planned for it, a well-oiled military operation could repair what was needed fairly quick. Now, to my original question of how you could have a war in the aftermath of this, recall that World War I was fought largely without electricity. You can still have rifles and machine guns and artillery and mortars and flamethrowers and tanks and battleships and even airplanes without electricity. You can even have nuclear bombs. Some of the existing ones might be rendered inoperable, though. You'd probably have to rip out the failsafes and retrofit them with older technology, but I'm sure it could be done. Now, even with no magnetic field, you can still have electronics and vehicles with electrical components. The problem would be computer chips. The increased levels of cosmic rays would cause an increase in hardware errors. How bad? I'm not sure. We have computers that operate out in space, so it is doable. Shielding against cosmic rays is basically the same as shielding against radiation. But let's pretend that's impossible. Do we still have military hardware lying around that doesn't rely on microprocessors? They do, if they know this is coming. There could be, secreted away in these deep bases, armor and aircraft designed with modern engineering and materials manufacturing that don't require computers to operate. A more than sufficient force to deal with, for example, a group of survivors who've declared sovereignty and no longer recognize the previous government. Diesel can be stored for over a decade, and you can make gasoline from coal as a more long-term solution, so they could easily stockpile enough of it to get through the first couple of years of the aftermath until they re-establish production. Alternatively, you could probably use wood alcohol or ethanol. Not as many BTUs in a gallon as gasoline, but you can make do. So as long as some military force with sufficient numbers and arms and resources manage to survive this, their shelter makes it through the quakes, then they would have the power to re-establish order. It might take a while, depending on how many of these deep bases we're talking about. But I fear we will be paying taxes again before you know it. Or, the tiny fraction of people outside of those bases who don't starve to death. But that's all military. What about daily life? Well, just because there's no electricity doesn't mean there's no power. You could still have running water, central heat, refrigeration, maybe even some appliances. The easiest option that comes to mind is steam power. Every building would be responsible for its own power in much the way that anybody with a well is responsible for their own water. Everyone would have a boiler that you either feed manually or set up some kind of a hopper with a mechanical system to feed it automatically, fueled by wood or other biomass. And you could use it to power a water pump, an air handler, a compressor. And if you want to get really fancy, instead of electrical outlets in the wall, you could have steam outlets, with appliances specifically designed to make use of that power source. And this is just one option I came up with off the top of my head. There are other choices, like wood gas. There are power tools that exist now that you can run on wood gas. What I'm saying is don't underestimate human ingenuity. There would be a lot of work to do. But as long as these deep bases had a reasonable number of people with the practical skills needed to do that work, we could be back on our feet in a surprisingly short amount of time. There is no reason we have to go back to the Bronze Age. In fact, I don't think we necessarily lose electricity. The grid would be nuked. If not from the induced current, then just from the earthquakes and flooding. And between the risk of superflares and the induced current from space weather due to the weakened magnetic field, we would probably not be able to maintain a reliable grid for several decades. But at a minimum, you could rip a permanent magnet motor out of an old refrigerator or an old dishwasher, hook it up to a bicycle, a water wheel, or a windmill, and power something right next to it with a wire that's too short to accumulate a huge amount of current. I'll bet you could even find a way to use the induced current intentionally as a power source, by setting up fields of coiled wire and just doing load balancing. Now, the induced current is kind of a quasi-DC, so I don't think the existing equipment we use for load balancing would apply. But it's doable. Now again, in the everything melts scenario, you would have to remake the copper wire, coil it to rebuild the motor, and then start making the things you actually want to power, like light bulbs and other motors. But outside of that scenario, we could come into this with all kinds of electronics. We might even be seeing the beginnings of preparation for this situation with the Green Energy Initiative. Renewable energy isn't. For example, the amount of energy it takes to make a solar panel, mining the materials, transporting them, manufacturing, assembly, installation, and maintenance, is about as much as the panel will produce in its serviceable lifetime. It's wildly inefficient. But there is one advantage to stuff like solar and wind. Power generation is local and diffuse. Right now, all of those solar panels and windmills are hooked up to the grid, so if we get hit with a Carrington event, they're gonna fry. But if they could come up with an excuse to segregate the grid, break it down into very tiny regional grids that generate their own power, with no physical connection between grids, then they wouldn't need the extremely high voltage transformers. And then the current induced by another Carrington event would not be a civilization-ending problem. The cost would be enormous, and it would not be enough to meet the electrical demands of modern society. The electricity would likely have to be rationed. That's what the smart meters are for. But having semi-reliable power is probably enough to keep things from collapsing entirely. And in the aftermath of the nova, they could be rebuilt more quickly and easily, and would likely still function even with the increased space weather. The occasional superflare might send you back to square one, but we have the determination, we can make that work. It might even be possible to have computers. Even in the everything melts scenario, and even if cosmic ray levels were so high that semiconducting microprocessors could not operate reliably, there's another option. Optical transistors. Transistors that use light instead of electricity, made with fiber optics and organic semiconducting polymers, no metal required. Now, you still have to generate the light, but could we come up with a non-electrical way to generate a stable source of light? Yeah, I think we could manage that. Publicly, this technology is only at the proof of concept phase. There's no economic incentive to pursue it right now, so it's unknown if the size-to-speed ratio could be made to match what we get from modern semiconductors. But could the powers that be have developed this technology in secret for this purpose? It certainly looks doable. Sound and display I'm not sure about. I'm not aware of any display technology that doesn't use electricity. LEDs are just so cheap and easy. Maybe some kind of a material that glows or moves when it's stimulated by magnetism or touch. At the very least, you could make some kind of a crude mechanical display like an Etch-a-Sketch or a Braille board or something. Likewise, it is really easy and convenient to make speakers with oscillating electromagnets. I haven't personally run across any non-electrical sound generating technology. It could probably be done. If not, there's always gramophones and solid-state recording discs made out of whale blubber. Which leads to the last big element of modern technology, communication. It is possible that the fiber optic trunk line going across the ocean would not get severed during the event, but it's actually wrapped in copper wire that powers the optical repeaters, so all of that's gonna melt. Which means global internet is not happening anytime soon. That project is impossible until the Earth's field recovers, unless we can come up with a communication system using quantum entanglement or something. The 5G network might be meant as the beginnings of a solution to this. Our aging copper infrastructure will not fare well as the magnetic field weakens. But if we transition the internet to the mesh of high bandwidth short-range repeaters that is 5G, and we couple that with small regional electrical grids, then a national internet might be possible up until the nova. Afterward, it would only work if we could handle the cosmic rays. Satellites? Gone. Cell phone towers? Only if you can get computers working. You can have long fiber optic wires because they're not conductive, but without computerized repeaters to boost the signal, your range is going to be limited. Probably about 100 miles. Radio? There would definitely be problems. Radio blackouts are a frequent occurrence even during regular solar storms. Ground waves like FM that only go as far as line of sight should be okay, but AM is only able to propagate as far as it does because the radio waves bounce off of the ionosphere, and how well the ionosphere reflects such waves is affected by solar particle bombardment and changes to the magnetic field, so that could see significant interference or be completely unusable. If all else fails, we can always go back to carrier pigeons and the beacons of Gondor. Anyway, I think I've made my point. Unless all of these deep military bases fall into a giant volcano, or have wildly misinterpreted what's coming and prepared for it completely wrong, this is not the end of modern civilization, which is good and bad. And that is perhaps the best introduction to the next section. What is the plan? On the one hand, an impending disaster that they can see coming like this makes sense out of how quickly things have been progressing in the last 10 years. I've heard it noted by many that the social engineers transforming society appear to be in far more of a hurry than they have been in previous decades. In fact, recklessly so, as though they're not afraid of being caught. Why not continue to play it safe and move things gradually? I've never heard a satisfactory explanation, but a hard deadline, a world-shaking event that they have no control over, that they know is coming soon, but not exactly when, that makes perfect sense out of it. Perhaps they saw the acceleration in the weakening of the Earth's field in 2010, the same time that we did, and then doing the math, they realized that it wouldn't be very long before the odds of another Carrington event happening became unacceptably high. And so they needed to have all of their pieces in place before then in order to take advantage of the event, and thus to shape the new world that would emerge on the other side of it. It's the ultimate problem-reaction solution. But since they didn't create the problem themselves, and it's such a potentially world-ending problem, they have to be very careful about how they set up their solution, or they might lose control. And I believe that this is what Agenda 2030 is really about. But then you look at what they're doing, and the question immediately arises, how does this make sense? The control grid, the massive surveillance network, the cashless society, the social credit system, the push for green, electric everything. Not only does all of this rely on electricity, it relies on a massive communications network, which is going to fail years before the nova happens and will not be possible to reestablish until decades later. So why are they wasting time building this? I can think of two reasons. Other than that, they just have no idea what's coming, which, again, is possible, but I wouldn't bet on it. One is that this is a beta test, that these are integral pieces of the society they eventually intend to build. So they're testing it out now and finding out what works best and what doesn't, and at the same time getting people used to it, so that in the aftermath, when people are longing for the way that things used to be, and the field strength is recovered enough to bring it back, they can be pushed into this dystopian model with much less resistance. The other reason is to be in a better position to prevent social order from collapsing when the lights go out. And I think that this is what 2020 was mostly about. Curfews, travel restrictions, prohibiting private gatherings, dress code. Planned or not, this was a de facto dry run for martial law. It was a test of what parts of the economy and industry we can safely shut down without collapsing the supply chain that keeps the critical pieces going. We learned where some of the weak points are. We accustomed people to having their food and necessities delivered to their door, as would have to be done when there's no electricity, either by the military or someone contracted by them. In short, we ironed out some of the bugs that might come up in a real martial law rollout, and we took a step towards normalizing it in the minds of the people. If my assessment of this is correct, then we will eventually see another such lockdown, probably justified by a different excuse. Maybe some kind of a global or regional war. My money is on the cyber polygon scenario. That could give us a chance to really test out what happens when the lights go out for a week or so. At some point, this will likely include rationing of food and fuel, perhaps simply for economic reasons or because of supply chain disruptions. When the next Carrington event arrives, how they handle it will depend on how bad they expect it to be. If the damage to the grid looks like it can be repaired in, say, a month or two, they may try to hold things together, because the longer they hold out before diving into their bunkers, the more supplies they'll have to get them through the aftermath. I'm not sure how feasible it would be to have the military sustain the entire population for more than a couple of weeks, though. Assuming you already have some kind of a breadline UBI system delivering food to people, you might be able to manage it for a while. You'd have to add water delivery to that, and in major cities you'd have to have trucks carrying out the sewage in garbage bags, because if you keep trying to flush the toilet without power in a skyscraper, bad things eventually happen. The city becomes uninhabitable within days. They would also have to militarize agriculture if they hadn't already, basically pressing farmers into service, in typical communist fashion. But even so, it's not possible to produce the same yields that we do without power. You need a steady stream of chemicals and replacement machine parts to keep it all going, and much of it is computerized, and those computers might be fried. Older farming methods could be used, but the yields will be much lower. This might be the motivation behind the recent push away from meat and toward plant-based meat substitutes. Maybe they think crops will be easier to manage than livestock in this situation, and so they want to push more resources toward that now. Export will not be happening during that time, so countries that have to import a lot of food to keep their people fed might be out of luck. In fact, even among those nations with the resources to do this, there may be some where they just don't bother preserving social order, and I believe the United States may be one of these. Because we have guns, they know there's a very strong chance that social order will collapse anyway if they try to cross certain lines that are necessary in order to bring us into this new system. So if they're unable to transform us in the same way that they have the European nations, they'll either drop the bottom out from the economy and let us languish as a failed state a la Venezuela, or they'll let us destroy ourselves in a Bosnian-style dirty civil conflict. Then after some time they'll come in and pick up the pieces. This is likely why they've been pushing the division and social unrest here so hard. That's their backup plan. The goal would be to keep enough of our production apparatus going in order to keep the military functioning, keep certain chosen groups of people fed, and to keep the rest of the people from getting in the way of that. Agenda 2030, I believe, is largely to assist with that last part. In the world where you will own nothing and be happy, having been robbed of agency, wealth, and resources such as personal transportation, storage space, and the disposable income needed to accumulate supplies, people will be more likely to go along with whatever plan they're told to. It will also reduce the number of survivors they have to deal with when they finally peek their heads out of the bunker after the nova. Because we know how they feel about the current size of the Earth's population, so why have more survivors than you really need to? Wasting resources in their amateur efforts to stay alive, especially people who might not be so receptive to their grand vision of how the world should be run. It really didn't have to be this way either. The grand solar minimum, the potential ice age, the radical shifts in climate, and subsequent mass die-offs in the biosphere, all of this would definitely make food scarce. I'm not saying that we would be able to sustain everyone who made it through the Annihilation event, but if we told the world this was coming decades ago, started building bunkers and storing food, and encouraged everybody to do the same personally, we could definitely have maximized the survival rate. And maybe instead of selecting people for the really good bunkers, have a lottery. Yes, I know that's the ending of the movie Deep Impact. But instead it looks like they want tight control over who's going to survive into the new age. And when they decide the time is right, they'll send out the call to the elite, and to a few million hand-picked laborers, scientists, and engineers from all fields, to have them take their seats on the giant arcs. Yes, I know that's the ending of the movie 2012. And make their deal with the devil so they can be counted among the survivors. That's the best I can come up with anyway. It's an okay theory. There is some serious logistical issues to overcome, but I think it's something along these lines. They want to gradually shift us into a martial law situation through some series of excuses so that they have a better chance of a controlled collapse rather than complete chaos. And lastly, the vision of the Bishop in White. There's really nothing new to talk about here. Ruined city, Pope and clergy get executed by soldiers. Was the city destroyed by a war or by the Annihilation event? Could go either way. But if the situation with Benedict and Francis really is what Bishop in White means, then it would have to be before, because there's no way Benedict is living that long. There's no reason that situation can't come up again, though, so that's hardly conclusive. On the other hand, the usage of arrows in addition to bullets might suggest that this is after. Maybe bullets are scarce in the aftermath, and that's why arrows are being used. I've always assumed the arrows were symbolic, but of what, I don't know. I've never heard a good explanation. Best I could come up with would be some kind of verbal attack or political tribulation. A white martyrdom presented alongside the red martyrdom. The arrows are still being fired by soldiers, though. If they were supposed to represent something like that, then they should be getting fired by politicians or pundits or just people in general, so it may actually be easier to explain literally than figuratively. But this does call to mind an interesting question. What will happen to the church after the Nova? International communication will be basically non-existent. You probably won't even be able to send a letter on a ship for a good while. So nobody's really going to know if the Pope is alive or not, let alone who it is. In fact, you might not know if your local bishop is alive. And if he is, you might not see him for a long time. That would make it pretty hard to coordinate all the bishops in the world to get the consecration done. So if it hasn't already been done before the Annihilation event, and given how things are going, there's a good chance it won't be, then it could take another decade afterwards before it's even possible to do. Our Lady told us it would happen, but if that's the timeline, most of us may not live to see it. The situation lends itself well to Father Martin's assertion that at some point the institutional organization of the Church would collapse and be replaced with something more similar to what we had during apostolic times. I imagine we'd see an increase in vocations, as tends to happen during desperate times. We would definitely be in emergency jurisdiction mode. Priests and probably even bishops could be anointed at the discretion of the local ordinary. By itself, that would not be enough to remove the corruption and heresy from the clergy, but maybe God will just make it work out in terms of who survives and who doesn't. You might want to take that into consideration when you're deciding where you want to be when this happens. And on that note, I want to share a few things in terms of prepping. All of the basics apply, but there are a few unique things about this scenario. For one, no matter where you live, have a life jacket for everybody. And if you have the money to spare, consider a dry suit. The event could happen in the winter, and even if it doesn't, the floodwaters could be coming to you from somewhere that's very cold, to the point of giving you hypothermia very quickly. An immersion suit will keep you alive in freezing water for a good while, but your mobility in one of those things is terrible, and given how much debris you're going to have to be dodging in the water, you might be better off taking your chances with the cold. You'll have to weigh that risk yourself. A dry suit will keep you relatively warm, but not as warm as an immersion suit. A boat would be useful for loading up with supplies so that you have something with you wherever you end up when the water recedes. Obviously avoid anything inflatable, and I wouldn't trust fiberglass with all that debris. You want something sturdy, like a raft made from logs tied together with heavy rope, or just a platform attached to some empty plastic water barrels. Otherwise, you are very likely to be able to climb on top of something that's floating by, so don't worry too much about it. There's one item that Chan Thomas mentioned that I would not have thought of, and that is a sextant, which, if you've never played Ultima 4, is a navigational instrument that will tell you your latitude and longitude using the relative position of the sun and the stars. This would be handy immediately after the crustal displacement, because knowing what your new latitude is will tell you if it's going to be very hot or very, very cold, and what direction you should travel in if you want to change that. There are two kinds of sextants. There are real sextants, as are found on actual commercial ships and military aircraft as an emergency backup, which are fairly expensive, and then there are the cheap desk toys you'll find on eBay. These are somewhat functional, but I haven't tried one and I don't know if they would be accurate enough for this purpose. If you don't want to buy a fancy navigational tool, there are ways to do this with a protractor and some sticks. You do have to at least know what hemisphere you're in for that to work though, so learn to find the North Star or the Southern Cross. And I was going to finish by talking about Faraday cages, but that turned into another really long and nerdy deep dive, so I broke that off into a third video. Check that out to learn how to build one or calculate how strong one is. And a fun tangent about levitating frogs. The short answer is that a Carrington-level solar storm will not cause damage to your handheld electronics or appliances as long as they're not plugged in. You don't need a Faraday cage to protect them. During the micronova, you might. It's hard to say. But since I've been thoroughly downplaying Ben's worst-case scenario this whole time, I do want to clarify a few things. While I am confident that the major powers of the world will be able to rebuild society after they peek their heads out of the bunkers, you will not see that. At some point, either from the flare between 2029 and 2036, or somewhere in the intervening years between that and the nova, it is very likely that either the grid will go down, or it will become very unreliable. Actually, at this point I could make that prediction for purely economic reasons. Just ask Venezuela. Depending on where you live, this might result in the collapse of social order. It could also very realistically collapse sooner for other reasons, so try to be ready for that as soon as possible. And after the nova, the earthquakes and the floods will destroy everything. There will be no infrastructure anywhere. The major governments will start rebuilding once they come out of their bunkers, but that could take many years, and you probably don't want to be part of the society they're building, which means that for probably the rest of your life, you and anyone with you are basically on your own. So if you're prepping, that's the scenario you want to have in mind. Any electronics you bring into that scenario with you are eventually going to break, and pretty much none of you are going to be able to fabricate your own replacement parts. So either have a lot of duplicates or don't rely too heavily on electronics. Also, there is a very real possibility that the next Carrington event will cause widespread fires, possibly in your house. So either consider storing your supplies somewhere far away from electrified society, or have a well-stocked bug-out bag ready to go. And if you make it through that, keep in mind that your neighbors likely did not prepare and are starving now, so have a plan ready to either feed them, fight them, or hide from them. And for those of you who've seen too many movies and think you're going to fight off a starving zombie horde, consider that all it takes is one Molotov on the roof and you lose everything. So unless you have a literal fortress and the manpower to guard the perimeter 24/7, that will probably not work out too well. And that's about all I wanted to talk about. I think it's a much better theory than what I had before. The biggest weak point is the spinning in Phase 2. Explaining that as representing an increase in the sun's rotational speed isn't terrible, but it's far from solid. And making the tip of the spear symbolic, and removing the direct connection between Russia's conversion and the chastisement, are both weaker than what I had before. But the miracle of the sun and the vision of the tip of the spear make a lot more sense overall this way. The weapon theory, while it was the logical conclusion when you incorporate all of the source material, it never felt right. It never seemed like something that could actually happen. And I'm not going to say what I have now feels right, but it doesn't feel wrong at least. And while it is sensational, once you've sat down and heard the science, I don't think it sounds crazy. I'm sure some of the details are wrong, you never get all of it right. But for the first time in my life, this is a Fatima theory I'm actually willing to put my money on. If it's ever going to amount to anything, I think this is it. And I was going to end the video with that, but I guess we'll finish up with a quick review of current events, because some people wanted me to talk about that for some reason. I'm really not sure why. There are plenty of other people who do a perfectly good job of that. But we can tie some of this to Fatima. So, as I mentioned before, if Lucy really did say that the Annihilation event corresponds to Apocalypse 8, and if Apocalypse really is in chronological order, then currently we should be starting to move into Apocalypse 6, the Four Horsemen. Now, 2020 does not qualify as a biblical plague, not even close. But the potential issues from the treatment, now that could be serious enough to qualify. I'm not going to risk going into details because YouTube, but if you don't know what I'm talking about, look it up. That's a fun rabbit hole to go down. I'm more concerned about famine riding in though, because that's pretty much guaranteed at this point. Back in April of 2020, the director of the UN's World Food Program was talking about famine of biblical proportions. Between some of the natural issues that came up, like the locusts and the swine flu and the avian flu, and the man-made issues like the supply chain disruptions and what appears to be intentional sabotage of our own food security, I think this is going to start to appear soon. In first world countries, it'll probably just be reflected in food prices, which will be difficult to distinguish from the inflation. But among the poor nations, you might actually start to see a significant uptick in starvation. Conveniently, that would provide a good excuse to nationalize agriculture and put it under military management. The war situation continues to progress the way I expected. First we have economic collapse and increasing social unrest, and then eventually some excuse to start World War III. My money is still on Iran being the trigger, but I would not fault you for picking China. If you're looking for a timeline on the economic collapse, follow Carl Denninger, market-ticker.org. His research is thorough, and his analysis is deeply insightful. The best I know of on the internet for just about anything he chooses to write about, but especially the economy. And if you want to stay up to date with what's going on with the Earth's field and the sun, watch Suspicious Observers. Every morning you'll get the incoming space weather, any new developments related to the magnetic field, and lots of interesting science. They even have a phone app that'll give you an alert if something is coming. If you want to hear me go through the science of all this, and the history of how the CIA and the Pentagon got involved, that should be next in the playlist right after the deleted scene on Faraday cages. I'm also planning a video on the imposter Lucy theory, because there's been a lot of developments on that and people keep bringing it up. So until then, take care guys. God bless.